Ladies and gentlemen, our panel is about competition policy in a globalized and digitalized world, challenges of today and tomorrow, and I'm very happy to have such a distinguished group of top antitrust experts here. Everyone knows. Anyhow, I'm going to very briefly introduce who will be here with us. We have with us two enforcers. Isabelle de Silva is the president of the French Competition Authority, and Makan Delrahim is the new head of the Antitrust Division of the US Department of Justice. On the other side, we have the lawyer side represented by Frank Montag. He's partner of Freshfields, Bruckhaus, Deringer, and chairman of the German Competition Lawyers Association. And we have the economists represented by Achim Wambach. Among many other functions, he's head of the German Monopolkommission and president of the Mannheim Center of European Economic Research. With that, let's start. The main topic we discussed today was the digital world, digital economy, and of course that's the mega trend we deal with as enforcers as well. Few big tech companies dominate the internet economy, and antitrust issues follow from that quite naturally. In Germany, we had legislation on that. We had many cases on Booking.com, on Facebook. In Europe, we had many cases, just to name the various cases against Google. On top of that, we have a discussion on platforms of regulation or whether antitrust is the right way to go forward. There are many discussions. The question is there a global consensus on how to deal with it? During the last administration, the last US administration, some commentators accused the EU of a bias against US tech companies. At the same time, others in the US criticized, in the US, the US authorities were criticized to being too lenient, kind of kid glove approach. However, we have seen proceedings in the US, but still, there's a perception that the authorities in Europe were more active than their US counterparts. What are the reasons for that? Are there different approaches, different priorities? Or if the perception is correct, are we going to see changes in the current administration? Makan.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for having me here and congratulating the Bundeskartellamt on your 60th anniversary. We've had a fantastic relationship over the years, predating me, but last time I was at the Justice Department as the international deputy. Andreas was also here in a similar role, and it's great to see him as the presidency, but I congratulate not only all the members of the Bundeskartellamt, all the past leaders, for what you have done to protect consumers and protect the marketplace. There's been a lot of discussion on both sides of the Atlantic, and in some ways it's welcomed. I mean, in the United States, we have a lot of this debate where you have different parts in both political parties questioning whether the last 30 years of antitrust enforcement has been effective, has it been aggressive enough? And different folks use it at different times for, it's public debate, it's a populist debate. It sometimes becomes a political debate in the United States and abroad. I think it's a welcomed opportunity to debate the issues of the proper role of competition policy and antitrust. We're having this debate globally, and lots in the United States where you have a lot of debate about what is it? What is antitrust's goal? What is it supposed to be? And one of the things that we have learned, and it's good to remind ourselves, both in the United States but also abroad, that ultimately competition policy is intended to protect the competitive process. As Johannes earlier said, we're the referees, whether we might be interactive spectators or referees, We are not the party players, and we're ultimately not the kingmakers of the participants in the marketplace. We ultimately should not, if we want to properly apply antitrust law, care who wins. We want the process to be fair so that they can compete, and in that process, ultimately, the consumer wins. And more importantly, innovation wins, which means you have dynamic improvements to lives of consumers and the citizens. I think the issue of the digitalization and the digital marketplace is an important one. That the facts may have changed, but I don't think the underlying analysis has changed or needs to necessarily change. We are dealing with a complex area and new sets of facts of whether or not they ultimately change. Does somebody's market share alone, is data traffic, or is the popularity of a particular application, it in and of itself mean that there's been a violation of the antitrust laws? Or does it mean it poses the question to begin with, and now we apply the rigorous standards and look at the facts and look at the economic evidence that we must apply to see if there has been a violation and if the competitive process has been hurt? That does one of two things: either hurts the consumer by decreasing the choices and increasing ultimate prices, or decreasing innovation, the incentives to innovate. Some of us choose to be on certain social networks. Some of us choose not to be on social networks. They're not necessarily required. I'm one who has chosen, for my own privacy reasons, not to take advantage of some of the free applications that might be there, but take advantage of some of them. One of my favorite applications I use almost every week, maybe multiple days, is one that is a French. It's headquartered in Paris, called Genius Scan and Genius Signature. I had no idea. I just assumed it was a Silicon Valley. Maybe it was my American arrogance. But it's a French company headquartered in Paris, and it's a fantastic app that I pay, $5, $6. It's not free, but I love the way it works. And competition has allowed me to make that choice, and I think that's really important. As far as being active, I don't think any one of us as enforcers should really factor or measure our success based on the amount of fines we get in cartels. I know that we put out press releases about how much we've gotten, nor the number of cases we actually bring. In the United States, my department's budget is just not enough to prevent all the anti-competitive activity that could occur. We often rely on private practitioners. When we make a case, we signal, and when we have transparency about our intentions, the private bar, the attorneys, advise companies, and most companies who want to be good corporate citizens, assuming they have enough deterrence, they will do the right thing and make sure there isn't. So most of the anti-competitive activity that could go on is being policed that way. We also have private actions, so there's private parties. We engage in amicus in the court systems under my leadership now in the district courts and the courts of appeals, not just waiting for the Supreme Court to get involved in private cases. We are doing a lot of that. I don't know how you measure activity based on that. We engage in mergers that come to us. One of my predecessors once at a Senate hearing said, I don't create antitrust violations, I just enforce them. And so a lot of times, the level of activity should really be measured by ultimately, are our markets competitive? Do we have the right level of innovation that our markets are allowing? And do our consumers have the choice? And that's the way I think we should measure ourselves rather than enforcement actions in and of itself.
Okay, thank you very much. The US companies are not only confronted with your authority, but in a global economy, they are confronted with many enforcers. What's your assessment of the international cooperation concerning that?
Well, first of all, I think the international cooperation is critical. What we do and what the ICN under Andreas's leadership has been able to do, and it needs to continue to be forward-thinking about how do we continue to improve that through other international fora, the OECD, and other conferences, we're constantly in touch with each other about the best enforcement mechanisms, whether it's in cartel, whether it's in unilateral conduct. It's important. Why? Because we don't want to have conflicting results in different jurisdictions. Most companies now operate internationally, and we constantly have to be vigilant in ensuring that there is a steady set of ground rules. And none of us, once we take a misaction, United States has its share of mistakes it made, particularly in the 1970s, 60s, in certain actions that later on, economics and actual behavior showed some of the enforcement actions were actually preventing very pro-competitive effects for consumers. And so we got to be sure that some of those activities that we might engage in does not limit the pro-competitive acts that a business community can take that benefits consumers across. We also got to be very careful about remedies that are, we have to be respectful of comity and sovereignties of other nations, other regimes. I recognize we have a different legal regime than some other countries do, so we have to be very respectful of each other's ultimate goals. But I think we all share the same goal. How we get there, that's where the international discussions and cooperation really help to make sure that ultimately we don't hurt the consumer.
Okay, thank you very much. When you see it from a global perspective, maybe you only think about the US on the one side and the EU on the other side, but the EU is not only the Commission. So, Isabelle, what is the role of a national competition authority in Europe nowadays?
It's a good question, because we might ask ourselves whether we are still relevant in terms of globalized economy, and what can a national competition agency do when we are tackling a huge technology giant. I think that Makan did a very good point when he mentioned that it's difficult to measure the efficiency of an agency, and it's not the number of fine, of the number of decision in itself that is a proof that the agency really fulfills its mission. I think that we've been asking ourselves in the recent months and years, how do we adapt to the digital economy? This is a very constant theme, and also because this is the main question that is being asked to the economy. All the companies have to transform themselves. So the point is, do we need to change the substance of competition law, or do we need to find some new tools to still be relevant as a national agency? And I think that on the point of substantive law, national competition agencies do not need to reinvent everything. We still have the good established principles, but we need to apply them to very new and different circumstances. So I think that all the work that we did in recent years about digital platforms, big data, and also from a theoretical point of view about network effects, now we are only starting to put them into practice. And I think that we still don't have that much case law. And when the Commission issued its decision on Google Shopping, I commented at the time that it was really a historic decision, not so much because the principles were so different than what we had been seeing before, because it was really an applied case of all those principles and thinking to a specific real economic case. So I think that the substantive framework is there. Still, I think that we are looking at new and different types of problems. Of course, there are the platforms and the booking cases at the national and the European level taught us a lot about how platforms work and the way we need to tackle those. And to give you an example of how this is affecting our activity today, we had recently our first case of a merger between two platforms in France. And of course, we had some things related to digital economy, but it was the first time that we had to say whether those two big classified platforms, and the buyer was Axel Springer, whether you could accept it, and the market shares were really very important. And how did we deal with this case? We studied very closely the way that the CMA and the Bundeskartellamt had revised some similar cases. And in our own decision, we mentioned the precedent of those two decisions, because we think that it's very important that we have as much as possible, a coherent approach within the EU. And that's one, I think, of the key points for us, that we really need to develop this globalized approach and to be very coherent as enforcers. So among the tools that we need to use today as national enforcers, I think, of course, that we know that interim measure will be relevant in the future because there is the issue of urgency in certain cases. And in that respect, the ECN Plus directive will really be a big change for all the member states that don't have this tool today. So we'll be looking at this as a new tool, very efficient for national agency. Of course, we can use commitment decision, that they can be an efficient tool. And I'd like to say something about the way we develop our thinking on those issues by sector inquiries or thinking about algorithm, for example. Because there is really a challenge for us to gain a very thorough approach of the economy, for example, like the Commission did with the sector inquiry on e-commerce, and what we are finishing right now about online advertising, because we don't only need the analytical tools, we also need to look at how those tools are related to real life and how the economy really works. And just to give this example, this online advertising really shows us that what we had thought with the Bundeskartellamt in 2016, that big data was really changing the rules in some way, we see that the reality is such that data is really the key factor on this online advertising business. So this is good to be able to go until the end of the study of the economy so that we are able to make informed decision after that. Just a final word on cooperation. I really think that on digital matters, as in broader competition matters, we need to talk to each other on an almost daily basis with other enforcers at European level, with the Commission, of course, and also within the ICN, that I think is really one of the most efficient tools that we have today.
And can we do more on cooperation?
I want to underline that it's been mentioned before this morning, the ECN is really one of the most resounding success of the European acquis as a whole. And what is not often perceived in Europe is that the ECN model is very innovative, and Johannes mentioned earlier that it is not often the case in the European policies that the Commission trusts the member states to do the job that was formerly that of the Commission, and it is doing it in a very flexible way. And when I meet my counterparts in Latin America or Asia, I really see the way they are looking at the European ECN as a model that they would like to develop at, for example, South America is thinking about doing a sort of ECN system. Asia is thinking about doing the same. Africa maybe tomorrow might be doing the same. So what I'm hoping for is to see some ECN all over the place in the world, and to be able to develop a cooperation not only with specific countries, but really with regional organization. And I think that is really the way of the future, and this will really help us to reach this globalized view that would be following what is happening on the economy.
Thank you. So your assessment that the national authorities are important in the future, that I like to hear, and maybe it's something where the kind of competition of ideas we heard about that before is a good thing. But I'm not entirely sure whether Frank Montag is sharing my view that competition of ideas is a good thing when you represent clients. What is your view on that?
Well, thank you very much, Konrad. But before I answer that question, I would like to congratulate, of course, the Bundeskartellamt, its staff, its president, for 60 years on behalf of Studienvereinigung Kartellrecht, on behalf of the German antitrust lawyers, the practicing competition lawyers. We do not always have a relationship without friction, and how could that be different, since we are, of course, representing the companies, their interests, their legal rights. But I must say, over the many years and decades, it has always been a relationship, also in individual cases, of respect and great admiration for the professionalism of the staff of the Bundeskartellamt, even if we do not agree. And I think we do always agree with respect to the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is the protection of competition on behalf of consumers. And may I add to this, competition itself is also an element of protecting liberal freedoms in our society. And I think on that level we clearly all agree, even though in individual cases we may not. And then, of course, we have President Limback to tell us at the end of the day who is right. Now that these are my congratulations. Now coming back to your question, competition of ideas, in particular in a global world of merger control. We now have about 140 or so jurisdictions who look at merger cases. And obviously in a globalized world, more and more transactions need to be notified across the world. Just to give you a few recent examples, which we know here in Germany, Maersk, Hamburg Süd, a shipping line merger, 23 countries. Yeah, you'd say shipping lines, okay, that's international, clear. Holcim Lafarge, cement, 30 countries. Or even better, AB InBev, SAB Miller, beer and beverages, 35 countries. So 35 jurisdictions around the world are looking at exactly the same transaction, from Canada to Argentina, from Japan to South Africa, and of course including the US and the EU. Now, fortunately, over the years, and the ICN, also under the leadership of President Mund, has come to quite a number of harmonized rules which are respected in many countries. That being said, even though we by and large have a similar substantive test which is applied to mergers, you still have lots of different procedural rules, different timetables, different thresholds, different ways of analyzing cases, and these ultimately also leads to different outcomes. Now, if I may, just a remark to the suggestion President Mund made earlier today in his conversation with Director General Leitenberger, namely to increase the thresholds of the European merger control regulation. Now, I think one of the great achievements of European merger control is the one-stop shop, that at least for the large mergers, we only need to go and see the Commission. And so by increasing the thresholds, of course, more mergers will come under national jurisdiction, which may be, from some point of view, a good thing, because authorities which are closer to these jurisdictions may have to deal with it. But from another point of view, if they concern many, many countries, then there are still ways to get them to the Commission, but it's more difficult, it's more burdensome, it takes more time. So from the point of view of the practicing lawyers and companies in general, what we are interested in is making these processes less complex. And Makan made the remark, and I think, Isabelle, you also said this, well, we are coordinating. That is true, but if you look at the coordination today, then you will find that this all often adds to the timetables, it adds to the complexity if there are lots of waivers, if you have to provide information which you give to one authority also to another. One of my favorite examples is the European Commission asking for all the documents which needed to be produced in the United States in a second request, and which those of you who know what a second request is know that it's just massive. And the only reason for that was that they said, well, we want to talk to the American colleagues, and so we want to have the same document basis. So there are lots of situations where the coordination among the agencies actually adds to the complexity, adds to the timetables. That being said, since there are so many jurisdictions, it's obviously necessary, because if I go back to my examples of the three cases, in all of these cases we had remedies. In one case it was 6 remedies, and the 6 jurisdictions in which remedies were required. In one case it was I think 9, and then in my favorite case, the beer case, it was 17 countries required remedies, including Botswana, Ethiopia, Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Honduras, Moldova. So it's getting more and more difficult for companies to run these processes, and also very, very expensive. And then if on top of this we have what you call the competition of ideas, i.e. A divergence of the standards which are being applied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, because some of these jurisdictions develop new theories of harm, then I must say the system may be going in a direction where it will no longer be workable. And if I may, just as a last sentence, ventilate an idea, then this would be, and I'm not the first one to do that, to think about it, whether it would not be possible in the future on some kind of international agreement similar to what we've got in the EU, to have one or several authorities where the center of gravity of a case lies, which will take the lead for their region or for particular markets, and then the other agencies perhaps follow their investigation, so that we do not need to duplicate the same investigation 30 times over. Thank you.
Frank, thank you very much. So for the first part, I would say the system creates huge business opportunities for law firms, so you must welcome it in a way, but from another point of view, I see the issue. So you spoke about the negative effects of competing ideas in merger control. Do you have a recent example?
Yes, but perhaps first to your first remark that we must be happy about the additional work. I mean, first of all, I think I can say that for all of my colleagues, that we have a certain ethical approach to what we do, and we don't want to just make money on our clients, but we want to help them to achieve their goals. So I don't think already from that perspective we are happy about this type of work. And secondly, it's not very satisfactory to do things which at the end of the day turn out to be irrelevant. So we want to do the important stuff, we want to do the work which really makes a difference, and we want to be remunerated for that. That's fine, but we don't want to go beyond. Now, do I have an example of a recent new idea which has led to some controversy and difficulty? Then it is clearly, I believe, the innovation theory of harm, which the Commission has promoted in its recent Dow-Dupont judgment. Most of you know that competition authorities have always looked at innovation, usually by looking at pipelines and at overlaps of pipeline products with existing products, or of two pipelines, and then the question was asked whether by combining the pipeline with the existing products after the merger, there would be market power because, for example, this company, the combined entity, would have the only product on the market. But now the Commission has gone a step further, and they have said that in certain industries where research and development plays a large role, and where it is possible to appropriate the results of early research because of the IPR patents, etc., that in those industries, a merger between two innovators, two companies who do research and development, may lead to an overall decrease of the level of research, not only of these two companies, but in the industry on the whole. And this is, of course, not an easy theory to deal with, because we're no longer looking at relevant markets. We are looking at something called innovation spaces, or the industry. And the question is, what is the industry? So very hard. We are looking at very, very long timelines, because we are looking at early research, and Dow-Dupont was a case in the agrochemical industry, where new pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, etc., are researched, or the active ingredients for them, like 20 years before they come onto the market. So you have to take a very, very early view. And then all of this is based on economic theories which are not tested, where there's a lot of debate about the economists whether or not, and I don't bore you with the details, Schumpeter or Arrow, appropriability or cannibalization are the important things to take into account. And all of this against a burden of proof, where the efficiencies which might be counter-arguments actually have to be shown by the companies. So I'm saying, when one of the big agencies advances such a new idea in a case which is then investigated throughout the world, this can also lead to inconsistent, if not contradictory, remedies at the end of the day. So Yes, intellectually, I see competition of ideas might be a good idea, but sometimes it's really hard for the companies.
Thank you very much. So, your critical assessment on the commission's approach in that case is maybe a little bit in tension with what was Makan saying about the role of innovation in the market, but maybe we can discuss that later. Before we deepen this discussion, maybe we listen to an opposite view. There was a general debate on whether competition authorities are interventionist enough or too interventionist. Minister Tsipras spoke about studies in the US concerning concentration. So, Achim, were enforcers too optimistic about market concentration?
Yeah, so what we see is that market power is on the rise. So I think it started 2013, a report by the Council of Economic Advisors to the American president that the top 100 companies in the United States have about 46% of the value added in the economy. It used to be 30%, now it's 46%, so a huge increase. And so that was one piece of evidence, and then the recent study which showed that across all sectors, more or less, the economic margin increased, again with American data, since 1980s. So we see a huge increase in the economic margins. We also see actually an increase in the concentration. 3/4 of the sectors have a higher concentration rate. These effects have been made responsible for the lower income share of labor. So it has been made responsible for the lower productivity growth we see. So it's not just, it's not just in the data, it really has, substantial economic effects. So, but before we take that, that debate is coming over to Europe, but, one first has to look at the European data. And the Monopoly Commission is, these top 100 companies investigation we do since 1978, and what we observe in Germany is that figure used to be 19%, and it's now going down, it went down to 16%. So there are 2 points which I think one could stress. One is, it used to be 19% in the States, it used to be 30%, so we always, we have an economy which is based more on small and medium enterprises, so we have a different economic structure. But also the trajectory is different. In the States, it's increased, in Germany, it decreased from 19 to 60%. Yeah, and with the other study, we also have done a study on the markups, the economic markups, and unfortunately only with data going back to 2007. And what we see is that during the financial crisis and the economic crisis, markups decreased and then they increased in Europe. But across Europe, we are not yet there where we used to be before the crisis. The story is different for Germany. In Germany, we are already above the markups we were before the crisis, and we are rising. Concentration rates haven't increased. So if you just look, and now coming back to your question, if you just look in concentration rates, maybe that's not, it's not sufficient. But let me take, what to take out of this data. One is, Europe is different from states. So if we have to take our own data and we have to analyze the case for Europe. Yeah. So that's one point we have. Second is, I think we have to watch out. We see the rising trends, and it's an issue that we have these increasing trends in margins, in accounting profits, in economic profits, in all those sectors. And the third thing is, yes, maybe concentrations, is too limited to focus on. We should also focus on other economic parameters.
And who's to blame for the concentration? Has antitrust its role?
That's actually, there's several stories, what caused this effect. One surely is we have heard so much about digital economy. So if we have platform effects, we have network effects, and they tend to lead to dominant firms like this winner-takes-all technologies, which we observe. Common ownerships might be another argument, that we see the rise in common ownerships, and also that might lead to stronger industry profits. But you're right, the third argument which is made is that, there's too lenient enforcement. Yeah, actually there are good reasons, also there are good stories behind that you can use. For example, as an economist, we use our merger simulation models typically, and they are static in their approach. So like innovations, it's not in those models. Yeah. So but one could argue, maybe it's good not to have it in the models, but it's not in the model. Yeah. So one can make this argument. On the other hand, we don't have really strong evidence that we have too lenient enforcement, and at least, from my point of view of the Monopoly Commission, we see still both. We see under-enforcement, but we also see over-enforcement, so it's not yet clear where we are at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much. Making as far as I understand, your authority has a substantial history of merger assessment and decisions, specifically on innovation competition. Frank Montag is stressing a little bit the over-enforcement part, and Achim Wambach is more stressing that there might be an under-enforcement. So what do you think is true?
Well, the possibility of over and under enforcement is always there, and it's how you look at it. I think I have said, and I've said it today, but a key part of competition policy is making sure that innovation is preserved and the right incentive for innovation is there. And in fact, you want to maximize that incentive. So because it's with innovation, you have dynamic competition. You might take a snapshot at any particular instance and say, well, wouldn't it be great if the consumer had a 10% lower price on a particular product at that one time? Yes, it would be. However, at what cost? Are we now doing that at the cost of the next wonderful thing, whether that be a heart attack saving drug for cholesterol that a wonderful French company, Sanofi, is now testing and marketing in the United States. Imagine this, not only the life savings, but the cost savings, the hospitalization and all of that, where that dynamic competition is served. We can deal with some of the issues that has been captivating a lot of enforcers, dealing with telephones. And, is the next generation and the capabilities of the next iPhone or Samsung phone better for the consumer to have, rather than maybe a 10% discount of having nothing better than the iPhone 3 or the iPhone 4, and that being cheaper for the next 5 years, rather than having iPhone 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever it is next year. I would submit that the dynamic innovation is really key for whatever enforcement we take. In mergers, we've always looked at innovation. Does the combination of the two companies in any way limit the incentive for those parties to innovate, or for a third party to innovate? But we look at the actual factual evidence and the economic evidence to do that. It's not hypothetical. We have to test it. We always bear the burden of proof when we go to court to challenge a merger. So then we have to test the evidence against an independent judge. And those theories need to be proved. So I think we always have to be vigilant and apply a rigorous test to make sure that there isn't over-enforcement that could harm innovation incentives, but making sure that there isn't under-enforcement in the appropriate role. So it is, whether it's merger or unilateral conduct, it's really key to calibrate that constantly with newer and better thinking.
Thank you. Frank, coming back to you. You spoke about too many authorities acting in parallel and dealing with too many different concepts. As we celebrate our birthday today, maybe you could look at this phenomenon in a more gentle way. For your clients, you're looking for advice, and sometimes you're looking for advice at different authorities. Many authorities are now producing papers, opinions, giving advice. How do you evaluate all these efforts, specifically in the digital economy, all these papers we are writing?
Well, first of all, I think that's good, because it shows that the authorities are thinking about the general principles which apply, the problems which they are facing in industries, and are not looking at individual cases. That is more the method of the courts. They can look at individual cases and they have to develop the law, but the authorities do have the possibility, because they have a larger degree of discretion, to also look at it in a more fundamental way and try to formulate policy. And then on the side of the consumer, as I'm a consumer of obviously what you do, the services of the competition authorities, I like to know for myself and for my clients what I'm facing and what the odds are likely to be. The worst thing for industry, for commerce, and for their advisors is uncertainty and unpredictability. If I don't know whether or not, because of some political reason, I will have to give a remedy or not. I remember a case, to just give you an example, where we had to give big remedies in the European Union, big capacity remedies, and where a authority of another country said to us, well, how many percentage of your capacity did you divest in the EU? Well, 20%. Well, I want 20% as well, but you don't have a problem. Well, don't you want to respect me? And then, that's the kind of thing we don't like. So if you give us guidance and we can rely on, and the authorities are actually applying it, that's clearly a good thing.
Thank you. Isabelle, Frank was quite critical on new concepts tested by authorities. And we have to admit, as competition authorities, that some new markets are uncharted waters. What would you recommend for us as competition authorities? Building up knowledge by doing cases, or doing sector inquiries or other research?
I think that's really like asking me to choose if I like better my father or my mother. I think I like them both, and I think we need to do both. Those are two very different exercises, and we see that when I look at the work done by other agencies, that a lot of us are doing sector inquiries, for example, on online advertising. I think there's a reason for that, those are very changing waters. We need to look at what is going on. It's a bit like discovering a new land. You first need to draft a map, and then you navigate the best as you can in this new land. And at the same time, a sector inquiry will never be as detailed and will never give definite answers to whether this type of conduct is an infringement, because you need to look at all the details and to see if on those circumstances such a practice will be considered an infringement. And sometimes it may be even difficult for an agency to tackle certain issues in the course of a sector inquiry, because the companies that are being mentioned, for example, they will be asking the same due process guarantees if you are going in a very detailed way in your appraisal. So you need to find the right line of between having a general view and not being too specific. And so we need sector inquiries. And what we can see is that we don't always find the same conclusions. We had the Dutch online sector inquiry on online advertising. Will be the French one. We'll be expecting the German sector inquiry on online advertising. And we may see different things, because there are still national markets, even though there are some globalized platform actors such as Google and Facebook. Still, you have national markets of different press actors and even specialized actors like those you see on display advertising. And on the other hand, we need some cases, that's clear. I really think that a decision like Google Shopping and what the tribunal will have to say on that matter will be really defining many questions. When you see, for example, the question of whether Google has a dominant position on the market of general online search. If that is confirmed by the tribunal, this has, of course, major consequences for all type of different activities by Google, even on national markets. So this will really bring a very definite answers to some questions that are being asked today. So we'll keep on doing both the best as we can.
Thank you very much. Achim, you were kind of very critical concerning the concentration in the US, or you referred about on that. Concerning the digital economy specifically, are you satisfied with the level of interventions on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah,
So I think a lot of things are going on. So actually it's an exciting time, and many sector inquiries and many cases, and so that's good. And I also agree that we still have to learn a lot. So we're actually quite happy that some cases may go to court, not because we believe that the court really has the final wisdom, but on the way to the court, we learn a lot, on these cases. So I think many things are going on. There's some critical things, Minister Cyprus already mentioned, dynamic, how the speed of decision taking and so on. Also in the United States, we have many cases. You see those cases come up. We all, we will learn a lot from AT&T and Time Warner. There are many things to be done. So, but let me make one point. I teach competition economics, and in competition economics, we have models with platforms, multi-sided markets, multi-homing, network effects and vertical. We have everything in it. What we don't have in our models is nationality. So I don't know an economic model where nationality plays a role. And it seems to be that, I've followed several debates where there is the tendencies of feeling that, Americans are different to Americans and Europeans. It's not in the model. We don't have it in our economic models. And so actually I think ICN is a good institution, and we should work hard, that we do competition policy to serve this purpose, namely to protect competition and, and not get this national identity into the discussion.
Thank you very much. So I got the sign, we have to move on. Thank you very much. That was a great panel. What are the takeaways? The first takeaway is, digitalization is changing the world, and antitrust enforcement is an important part of it. Second, of course, one might diverge on specific questions. There's the issue of over-enforcement, under-enforcement, and this is a legitimate debate, and we have to discuss it on specific cases. And third, to end with a positive message, even if we disagree on specific issues, we speak the same language as advocates of competition. We act within the same mindset, and there's a broad consensus that international cooperation is a good and necessary thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to finish with a great thank to this great panel, and join me in thanking the panelists.